They said I couldn't handle it. That I cracked under pressure, walked away from duty, brought shame to the family name. When people asked, my father would tighten his jaw and say, "We don't talk about Jules." At holidays, they'd pull out all the stops for Claire Balloon's flag speeches. For me, I once got a folded napkin and a cold glance. When she graduated from officer school, they hung a banner on the porch and handed out photo magnets with her face on them. I wasn't even in the group picture. The truth, I never stopped serving. I just had to disappear to do it right. But today, I'm here, sitting on a metal folding chair near the grill, back against the splintery fence, while the family buzzes around Claire like she's the second coming of Patton. There's a banner above the patio that reads, "Congratulations, Lieutenant Claire." She's beaming in her dress, blue standing straight, like she was born with a salute in her hand. She deserves her moment. She worked for it. But so did I once. Don't touch the ribs, Uncle Marty warns me with a wink, like he's still trying to pretend we're close. I nod politely even though I'm not hungry. The smoke from the grill stings my eyes. Claire sees me from across the yard and raises an eyebrow. "Well, look who finally came out of hiding," she says loudly enough for the people near her to hear. "Didn't think the ghost of Northpine would show up." I give a small smile. Nothing more. She walks over a drink in hand, her uniform sharp, her confidence louder than the Bluetooth speaker playing classic rock. "You want a seat up front?" she asks, gesturing toward the patio. "Or is the edge of the backyard more your style?" "Now I'm good here," I say. She smirks. "Thought so. It's where all the dropouts sit, right?" Before I can respond, Dad walks by. He doesn't look at me. He's wearing his old army cap, the one with faded insignia. "I'm proud of my daughter," he tells the man next to him. "Claire made it through with honour. Only one of mine had what it takes." I keep my face calm. The tongs in my hand click softly against my plate. People keep chatting, laughing, raising drinks. No one notices me. Or maybe they all do and pretend not to. Kids run past, chasing a soccer ball. A dog barks somewhere near the porch. My mother brings out another tray of corn on the cob, brushing off her apron like it's a stage costume. Claire's boyfriend, tall, sharp haircut, new agency polo, walks by and glances at me. Just another shadow in the corner, his eyes say. A civilian maybe, a mistake. But that's the thing about shadows. Sometimes they hold more power than the spotlight. "Excuse me," he says, stopping. He looks closer, squints. "Sorry, but were you ever at Northpine?" I blink, caught off guard. "Yes." His posture shifts. His voice drops. "Wait. Echo. 7. Mom, I served under you. Langley, Red, Mesa Op." The plate in my hand tilts. A hush falls over the group near us. My mother freezes mid-step. My father's beer bottle stops halfway to his lips. He straightens. "Director, Jules Hartley." I nod just once. He snaps to attention. "Mom." Silence swallows the yard. Conversations stop. Claire's eyes widen, the glass in her hand trembling slightly. Nobody says a word. Because for the first time they see me. Not the failure. Not the dropout. Not the daughter who vanished. They see the woman who outranked them all. My name is Jules Hartley. I've been many things: cadet, analyst, ghost, and for a time, director of operations for a division that officially doesn't exist. But before I tell you how I got here, I want to know you're with me. Drop a quick hi in the comments or let me know where you're listening from. If you've ever been written off, ignored, or misjudged, you'll understand why this story matters. Because sometimes the strongest voice is the one that doesn't raise itself. And now, let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment I chose truth over approval. It started at Northpine. Back then, I still believed in the system. I believed in rules, in honour, in rising by merit and falling by fault. And I believed, perhaps naively, that the truth would protect me. I arrived at Northpine with my hair tucked tight and my spine straighter than it had ever been. I was top 10 in academics, top 5 in field performance. My evaluations read like recommendations, focused resilient leadership potential, evident. I made my bed sharp, ironed my fatigues down the centre, and never once forgot to salute. I was that cadet. The problem began in our second physical qualification review, what we all called Hell Week. It was when everything got harder, sweatier, crueler, and strangely quieter. People broke in Hell Week. Knees, buckled shoulders, popped egos shattered. It was designed that way. But some cadets I noticed weren't breaking at all. One of them, in particular, Matthew Conroy, son of Colonel Richard Conroy, the Deputy Director of Training. On paper, Conroy was average, maybe below. His mile time lagged. His pull-ups were always borderline past, and during combat drills he often stumbled or hesitated. But no one said a word. The instructors watched him struggle, then checked the box anyway. At first I thought I was imagining it. I wanted to be wrong. So I started tracking it quietly in a notebook under my pillow. It was subtle. A red pen here, a nod there. But over a week, a pattern emerged. Someone was altering Conroy's performance scores. He was being passed manually, not just passed elevated. On day 6, I found one of the assessment sheets in the trash behind the gym. It had 2 sets of handwriting. One was the original score 59, the other overwritten in a different ink 85. I brought it to our ethics supervisor first. She glanced at it, sighed, and said, "Be careful with accusations, Cadet Hartley. Sometimes what looks like favoritism is just grace under pressure." But I wasn't accusing. I was reporting a falsified record. So I went higher. I compiled everything, notes, sheets, timestamps. I turned it in to the oversight board. I expected it to be handled discreetly, professionally. It wasn't. Within 3 days, the investigation turned. The board questioned my intent, my emotional judgment. They said I'd shown undue fixation on another cadet's performance. They asked whether I had a history of rivalry with Conroy. And then came the code phrase, violated the spirit of cohesion. They told me I was being recommended for removal, not for what I'd found, but for how I found it. For failing to uphold the cooperative ethos of Northpine. My final report called it a behavioural deviation. My record was marked ethically compromised, and my scholarship revoked. I remember packing my gear that night, fists shaking as I folded my shirts. Claire was still in high school then. She messaged me once, "Heard you're coming home, and that was it." No question mark. No, "Are you okay?" But it was my father's reaction that sealed the wound. He didn't call, didn't write. When I walked into the house that first night back, he didn't even meet me at the door. He stayed in his armchair, watching the news, and said, without turning, "You embarrassed the name. Do you understand what that means?" I said, "I reported fraud." He said, "You made noise." He called it a stain. Said no one remembered whistleblowers, only troublemakers. And then, as if offering some twisted comfort, he added, "We'll say it was your health, that you weren't cut out for it." That line followed me for years. Wasn't cut out for it. I heard it at family dinners in sideways glances in Claire's tight little smiles. She once told someone at a church potluck that I used to want to be military, but it didn't work out. Like I'd failed a dream, not a rigged game, and maybe I could have let it all go if the system had been honest about its betrayal. But it wasn't. It lied. It dressed its punishments in language that made me the villain. So I disappeared. But not into shame, into something else entirely. I was still packing what little I had from the academy when she showed up. Not with a badge, not with backup. Just a woman in civilian clothes leaning against the rusting railing of the bus stop near my old high school. "Jules Hartley," she said as I passed. I froze. The name sounded foreign already, like a version of me someone else used to wear. "You've been watched," she said, "but not the way you think." She pulled a thin envelope from her coat and handed it to me. Inside, a single page, typed, no signature. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a second chance. It was an invitation. If you believe integrity matters more than approval report, to room 411 Crystal Building, Zo 600 Wednesday. No logos, no threat, no promise. I didn't go right away. I sat on it for 2 days, rereading the paper so many times the corners started to curl. My father still hadn't spoken more than 10 words to me since I'd returned. Claire avoided me, except for when she passed through the kitchen with her usual smirk. I could hear her on the phone with her friends laughing about the prodigal soldier. I knew then I wasn't going to find redemption here, at least not the kind that fit in a neat box. Wednesday came. I took the metro across the river into the district and found myself in front of a dull, grey tower with tinted windows and no name. The security guard at the front desk didn't ask for ID. He just looked at me and nodded toward the elevator. 411. Room 411 wasn't an office, it was a holding room. Plain chairs, blank walls, one table and a woman waiting inside. She looked like someone's aunt until you saw the eyes. Eyes that had seen too much and regretted nothing. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "Have a seat," said. I did." She didn't smile. She didn't offer me coffee. "You were tested," she said. "Not by the academy. By us." I didn't understand at first. I thought it was metaphor. She shook her head. "The Conroy file. The manipulation. The push to have you removed. That wasn't an accident. It was observed, orchestrated, designed. We needed to see if you do the right thing when it cost you everything." I felt the air leave my lungs. "You let that happen, we didn't let it," she said. "We engineered it. I wanted to stand. I wanted to yell. But something in me stayed still." "Why?" "Because truth is rare," she said. "And people who won't bend it even when the system tells them to are rarer. You didn't try to negotiate. You didn't run to the press. You didn't retaliate. You walked away clean, quiet. That's the kind of mind we can trust." She reached into her folder and pulled out a black card. No name, just a silver emblem of a circle intersected by a vertical line. "Orion Division," she said. "We're not listed. We don't get medals. We don't take credit. But we see everything." I asked her what she wanted from me. "Everything," she said simply. "Your name, your past, your file. You'll disappear from every federal system. No forwarding address, no pension. But you'll know the truth before anyone else. And you'll be the one who gets to act on it." I stared at the card. "And if I say no, you go back to being the dropout, the disgrace. You rebuild your life with lies that taste like metal. And you'll always wonder if it meant anything." I didn't sleep that night. I walked the city for hours replaying every moment of the past year. Every stare, every silence, every time my father shook his head without words. I passed a storefront where a TV played the news. A senator shaking hands with a general, smiles, flashbulbs. I wondered how many of them wore masks. At dawn, I called Evelyn. "I'm in," I said. That morning, I signed a document. I didn't fully understand, surrendered every piece of ID I had, and walked into the Orion complex through an unmarked freight entrance. There were no welcome packets, no oath, just a plain steel door that clicked open after retinal scan. On the other side, a hallway lit in harsh blue-white, the smell of cold air and ink. A voice crackled in my earpiece as I stepped forward. "Welcome to the division." Echo 7. My name was gone, but for the first time I felt real. There were no uniforms in Orion, no stripes, no plaques on the wall, only results. My days began with encrypted files, biometric scans, and briefing rooms filled with faces I never learned the names of. We didn't salute, we didn't make small talk. We shared intel like lifeblood, and spoke in codes, not pleasantries. My first assignment was a desk in a dark room, 3 levels below ground, wedged between a humming server rack and a wall that smelled faintly of solder and burnt dust. They handed me 37 gigabytes of raw surveillance data and asked me to find what they called the pulse. I didn't know what that meant. No one explained. That was part of the test. I found it in a 5-second gap, an anomaly in a routine voice transmission from an officer in Kabul. A skip in the audio just enough to suggest a word was spliced. Turned out it was a coded phrase slipped into the chatter coordinates for an arms drop tagged as humanitarian aid. The Fallout 3 resignations, 2 quiet transfers, 1 court-martial. My name wasn't on any of it, but Evelyn showed up the next morning, coffee in hand, and said, "Nice pull." That's how it worked. You did the work. You watched the walls close in around the enemy. And you kept your head down. No press releases, no medals. They started trusting me with more. I moved from audio analysis to cross-channel pattern work. Then, field-adjacent roles vetting intel, passed through regional, command, red flagging discrepancies in procurement logs, digging through psychological profiles of officers with too many inconsistencies in their mission reports. I was never in the spotlight, but I was always close enough to feel the heat. Once I flagged an intercepted memo that implied a battalion commander in Jordan was laundering discretionary funds through a fake NGO. The Orion response team confirmed it within 72 hours. They called it internal recalibration. I called it a quiet war. One no one knew I was fighting. At some point, I stopped counting the files. The people, the agencies, the near misses. But I remember the first time someone from outside Orion referenced one of my reports. A lieutenant colonel at a joint intelligence summit used the term Echo 7 summary model in a slide deck. He didn't know it was me. I was sitting in the back, dressed like a civilian tech rep. But my hands shook. I'd become a ghost with weight. We rotated assignments constantly. 1 month I was in a war room beneath the Pentagon. Next, I was embedded in a logistics unit in Nevada under the guise of a systems auditor. There was a moment in a supply hangar at 2:43 a.m. where I realized I hadn't spoken to anyone using my real name in over a year. That night, I stood under the fluorescent hum, staring at a shipment manifest that didn't match its digital counterpart, and whispered to myself, "You don't exist, but you're saving everything." Sometimes I wondered if that was ego, but mostly it felt like survival. The kind that wasn't about bullets, but about carrying the truth in pieces no one else wanted to hold. Once, after shutting down a falsified asset transfer program in the Balkans, I got a handwritten note on a plain white card. No signature, just the words, "Hold fast. The structure bends before it breaks." I pinned it to the inside of my locker. Years passed like that. Quiet, efficient, ruthless in a way only silence can be. Every now and then, I'd hear whispers about officers I'd helped bring down resurfacing somewhere else, repackaged, redeemed by the same system that tried to erase me. It used to make me furious. Then Evelyn told me something that stuck. Corruption doesn't end. It recycles. Your job isn't to fix it forever. It's to slow it down long enough for better people to catch up. By the time they offered me directorial oversight of Field Strategy Cell 4, I barely hesitated. I signed the protocol in a bunker in Oslo using a code name that didn't belong to anyone else. I didn't smile, I didn't cry. I just whispered, "Echo 7 confirmed." They deployed me to Ridgeport 2 weeks later. A quiet coastal base that didn't make headlines, but moved sensitive material through channels delicate enough to collapse from a whisper. The briefing was minimal. Intel leaks suspected damage control needed. No names, just a location, a time frame, and one directive contained before exposure. I arrived under the guise of a liaison from a cybersecurity consultancy, the kind no one questions because they don't want to admit they don't understand what we do. My credentials were impeccable, my cover flawless. But behind my visitor badge was a tracker connected to Orion. Every step I took, every system I accessed, they monitored, silently waiting for results. The first 24 hours were chaos masquerading as order. I watched too many passwords being scribbled on paper, too many conversations held in hallways, and an alarming number of login traces bouncing between terminals after hours. Something was wrong. The pulse wasn't in the data, it was in the culture. On day 3, I noticed a strange loop in the outbound logs, compressed packets being rerouted through a dummy weather station, uplink every Thursday between Euro 200 and Euro 215. It was buried under routine diagnostics and disguised as satellite sync, but the metadata showed timestamps overlapping with restricted file access from command storage D7. I traced the pattern, built a probability model, and by day 5 I had a signature. It wasn't an outside hack. It was internal, someone with admin-level clearance, pushing tactical briefs out under the guise of maintenance logs. The signature pointed to a shift supervisor named Lowry. 46, former NSA, quiet, never married, no social trail, but one bank account flagged for irregular international deposits. On day 6, I handed my findings to Evelyn through a secure relay. Her message came back 2 minutes later. Contain, neutralize, no public trail. The arrest wasn't flashy. I walked into the base control room at 0213 on Thursday and unplugged the uplink node. Lowry was there pretending to calibrate weather data. I asked him how long he thought he could run a leak like that. He didn't answer. Just blinked once. I showed him the packet trace. He sat down slowly, like his body already knew it was over. The rest was clean. Quiet extraction. No base announcement, no courtroom. Orion took him through channels no one ever sees. Within hours, the breach was plugged, protocols reset, and the command brief diverted from review. The media never caught a whiff. The next day, a sealed envelope appeared in my temporary quarters. Inside a single badge, black, sleek with the Orion insignia, and a new title embossed in Matt Silverfield Colonel, Shadow Command. I turned it over in my hands, half expecting it to disappear. The rank meant nothing outside our walls. But inside, it was the highest field honor given in Orion for operational precision. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even keep the badge out. I slipped it into my gear bag, zipped it tight, and went back to reviewing access logs. What mattered wasn't the title. It was what came with it, trust, autonomy, and the freedom to make decisions without waiting for permission. Before I left Ridgeport, one of the young officers approached me in the mess hall. He didn't know who I really was, just that I'd somehow made the chaos stop. "You're not one of us, are you?" he asked, trying to smile. I paused, then said, "I'm just someone who believes rot doesn't belong in uniforms." He nodded slowly. "Well, thanks. For whatever you did." I left the next morning before sunrise. No send-off, no file transfer. Just a silent drive back to the airstrip. In my Orion debrief later that week, Evelyn slid a report across the table. 3 bases adapted your threat assessment matrix. 1 command rewrote their internal audit process using your Ridgeport model. Not bad for 6 days. I nodded, already thinking about the next assignment. Because that's what happens when you work in shadows. You don't savor victories. You use them to sharpen the next blade. The next blade pointed me home. Fort Holden. A ceremonial base, more show than threat, but still a hub for logistics and optics. Evelyn's message was brief signal, integrity audit, duration, 48 hours cover, as a third-party comms tech. I didn't ask why, until I saw the schedule. Claire Hartley, Lieutenant, to be recognised for service distinction and promoted to company commander during the live broadcast Armed Forces Day review. I stared at the itinerary for a full minute. My sister, being venerated on a base I once cleaned windows for as a cadet. The irony didn't sting. It pressed. I arrived under a badge that read J. Holden Spectra Systems, VA, blue polo, black pants, lanyard with microchip access and 0 rank. My hair was tucked in a cap. Nobody looked twice. That was the point. Inside the control tent, I made contact with 2 Orion liaisons embedded in the event's AV and broadcast loop. They nodded once confirmation, not greeting. Our job was to patch any signal exploits before they could disrupt or leak high-value moments. It was simple. But Evelyn had warned me, simple doesn't mean soft. Day 1 was quiet. I spent 6 hours scanning router nodes, tightening encryption relays, checking for packet delays. Most of the officers ignored me. One joked, "You IT folks always look so serious." I smiled politely, never lifting my eyes. That night, I slept in a barracks guest unit that smelled like old brass polish and dust. Day 2, Claire arrived. I spotted her before she saw me laughing with a cluster of junior officers, polished shoes clicking against the pavement hair, pulled into a tight regulation-perfect knot. She looked exactly how our father had once wished I'd become, and nothing like the girl who used to follow me around the house in muddy boots. She walked past me in the East Wing hallway. Didn't blink, didn't flinch, but later outside the mess area she turned. "Hey," she called. I paused. She stared for a moment, then gave a half smile. "You look familiar. Were you ever military?" "Sort of," I said, not lying. She tilted her head. "Thought so. You've got that stiff posture. Still remember how to stand at attention, or did that fade after the dropout?" I didn't answer, just met her eyes. Claire looked me over once more, then said with a casual cruelty, "Only family can manage, chin up. You're just in time for the real thing." That night, I stood behind the main stage area, checking relay feeds and blocking out the noise of speeches. My earpiece crackled once Orion's handler confirming green signal and no breach attempts. I should have felt nothing. But I watched my sister on stage, shaking hands with brass who'd once looked through me like I was smudged glass. Her smile was genuine, her salute crisp. And in the crowd I saw my father, upright, proud, his uniform pressed sharp, his mouth tugged into a rare, restrained smile. It should have broken me. Instead, I wrote one line in my notebook that night. "You can't be invisible if you know where to look." Later in the mess line, I overheard Claire talking to one of the officers she brought with her. They were laughing something about being the golden girl of Fort Holden. Then I heard it, "You know my sister was supposed to be the star, but she burned out before anyone could remember her name." Sad, really. All that training wasted. The officer chuckled. "What happened to her?" Claire shrugged. "Who knows, she left. Or maybe the system left her. Either way, she's just a story my dad avoids telling." After the ceremony, I passed her briefly near the equipment van. She stopped me again. "Hey, Tex girl," she said with a grin, holding her coffee like a trophy. "You still remember how to stand at attention, or are you more comfortable standing at the edge of things now?" I looked at her. No smile, no sting, just a steady breath. "I stand where I'm needed," I said quietly. She laughed sharp and dismissive. "Yeah, sure you do." That night, I sat alone outside the barracks looking up at the stars through static in my earpiece, and I whispered to no one, "Still here, still watching, still holding." The next morning, as the sun cut gold across the tarmac, I stepped into the East Side operations tent to run a final sweep of the relay grid. That's when I saw him, Master Sergeant Holtz. Retired technically, but still consulting for training standards. He was the kind of man whose name still carried weight in briefing rooms. He'd drilled me once a lifetime ago before everything fell apart. He looked older, now slower, but his eyes were sharp. When he passed by my station, he gave a small pause. Then, without looking at anyone else, he muttered just loud enough for me to hear Echo 7. "Thought that was you." My fingers froze over the keyboard. I didn't reply, didn't move. but my pulse kicked hard against my collar. He gave the faintest nod, then walked on like nothing had happened. But someone had heard. Claire was standing 10 feet away, chatting with another officer. I saw her glance toward us mid-conversation, a flicker of confusion washing across her face. She turned back slowly, but I knew that look. She'd catalogued the moment. Later that afternoon, I caught sight of her in the archive wing, an area restricted to approved personnel, but Claire had the clearance. She stood in front of a terminal, fingers moving through old training records, evaluation logs, dismissed cadet reports. The screen reflected in her eyes, her brows knit tighter. She was looking for me. That evening, as Brass toasted her achievements in the officers' lounge, Claire slipped out. I watched her from the far end of the yard, leaning against a railing near the perimeter path. She lit a cigarette, something she hadn't done since college, and exhaled a long, thoughtful stream. I approached not to confront, but to confirm. She didn't look surprised to see me. "Echo 7, she said, not a question. I said nothing. She turned toward the fence. "When we were kids, you told me that was your superhero name. Echo 7. I thought you made it up. Some secret club in your head." Still, I stayed quiet. Claire tapped ash into the wind. "You disappeared like a ghost. But the way that guy said your name, it wasn't casual. It was protocol." I looked past her toward the dim lights of the barracks. "You always were good at piecing puzzles?" She stepped closer. "What did you do, Jules? Where did you go all these years?" "Somewhere the record ends," I said. She shook her head slowly. Did you leave on your own, or were you pushed?" I met her eyes then. "What do you think?" Claire swallowed. "I think Dad lied to me. I think everyone did." That night, I found her standing alone outside the mess, scrolling through something on her tablet. I passed by without speaking, but saw the screen a search page filled with old news bulletins, redacted documents, and one name repeated again and again, Echo 7. The next day, Claire cornered Holtz in the supply hall. I watched from across the corridor. Her stance was formal, but her voice rose just enough to catch. "Why did you call her that? Echo 7. What does that mean?" Holtz gave her a long, measured look. "Ask your father," he said. "Or better yet, ask your sister." "She's not my sister anymore," Claire snapped. "She left us." Holtz didn't flinch. "Or maybe she protected you in ways you'll never understand." Claire looked stunned, hurt, angry, but more than that, shaken. That night, I returned to my quarters to find a folded slip of paper under my gear bag. No name, no stamp. Just one line printed in neat square letters. Echo 7, tell me the truth. C. I stared at it for a long time. Then, I slipped it into my notebook beside an old photo, two little girls in army jackets, too big for them, saluting the camera in front of the Fort Holden gates. She remembered, even if she didn't want to. That memory didn't ask for permission, it simply surfaced. After that moment, outside the barracks, Claire didn't speak to me for 2 days. But I noticed the difference. She stopped laughing quite so easily with the other officers. Her questions during briefings became shorter, sharper, and more private. And once, when she passed Holtz in the corridor, she looked at him not with curiosity, but with calculation. The next evening, I returned to my quarters to find something slipped under my door. It was thin, wrapped in a manila envelope, and smelled faintly of dust and cedar. I opened it to find my old field journal, the one I thought I'd lost after Northpine. The one I had assumed the system had confiscated and buried. Inside was my handwriting technical sketches unit, formations, code references. And near the back, faintly penciled under a crease in the margin, were 6 digits, the emergency access primer I used when I worked in off-grid systems. There was no note, no explanation. Just the journal returned. The next morning, I saw Claire and Holtz, speaking in the shadow of the operations tower. She looked tense. He looked careful. When they parted, she carried with her a compact Orion relay device, flat, steel grey, barely larger than a playing card. It was a temporary clearance node, the kind used to bridge secure legacy archives with Orion's ghost network. She waited until late that night, after most of the base had gone quiet. I followed her from a distance, not close enough to be noticed, but close enough to know she was heading toward the off-records terminal, the one used for mission reviews that never made it into public systems. She slipped the relay into the port, entered the 6 digits from my journal, and paused. The screen blinked, asking for confirmation. She exhaled, tapped once more, and the archive opened. What she saw changed her. The first file bore my initials and a date, the day I filed the report at Northpine. Inside were photographs of doctored test scores, comparison logs of biometric data, and a handwritten account describing the moment I confronted the falsification. The name of the cadet, protected by the scheme Thomas Merrill, son of Colonel Merrill, head of the Academy Board. Attached was my signature. Below it, the words, violation of integrity standards, recommended escalation. Then came the command response. 1 paragraph, concise and cold. Due to potential reputational damage to the Academy and the military institution at large, we advise voluntary withdrawal under conduct reassessment. It was signed by R. Hartley, my father. Claire's fingers hovered over that signature for a long time. Then she clicked to the next file. Project Echo 7. This one was heavier. A full deployment analysis listing behavioural assessments, psych evals, operational successes, redacted names, redacted locations. But the photo was there, my face, unsmiling eyes sharp. The caption asset confirmed. Deployment approved under Orion Tier 3 protocol. Claire sat back in the chair. She didn't move for a long while. Eventually, she unplugged the relay, wiped the keyboard clean, and left. She didn't speak to anyone the next day. But she didn't have to. Her silence had changed. It was no longer judgmental. It was reverent. That night, she stood in front of the officers' hall, staring up at the flag as it swayed gently in the wind. Her hands were in her pockets, her stance different, wider, heavier, grounded. I passed behind her without a word. But she turned her head just slightly and said, "You didn't run." I stopped. "No," I said. "No, I didn't." "They made it look like you did," she added. "They made sure everyone saw it that way. That was the point." Claire nodded, eyes still on the flag. I didn't want to believe it, but I do now. And then she said something that cut through the cold night air like a blade. I would have done the same. Maybe that's the part that scares me. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Some truths don't need answers. They just need space to land. The ceremony wound down. Claire's final applause faded like a receding tide. The crowd was strained with polite smiles as she descended the podium steps, medals, bright posture proud. I hovered near the periphery, hidden behind the catering tent, where I'd welded encryption relays. I smelled solder and sweat. No uniform, no recognition, no place. Just the faint hum in my earpiece reminding me of my real role. Then I heard my father's voice over the fading conversation. He approached the microphone again, unexpected, unplanned. The crowd turned. Richard took a breath, smiled too wide and said, "I've served this country for 35 years, but I've never met a more outstanding officer than Claire Hartley. She is the finest example of discipline, courage, and honour our family can offer." His voice cracked once at finesse like a dam barely holding. Warm applause broke out again. Claire's jaw clenched. She glanced toward me, saw me. I didn't move. That's when I noticed the door at the far end. Watching it. Waiting. The hush began from the back rows washing forward in faint waves. Phones lowered. Forks stopped mid-bite. Heads turned to the entrance like wind chimes caught by a breeze. General Marcus Sloane entered. He didn't need to stand tall, he carried moonlight in his stride. Star of legend, glint of discernment. He didn't walk toward the stage. He walked the centre aisle. Slow, purposeful. Past Claire's tableau of honour. Past my father, straight-faced before family came into play. No one moved to stop him because you never stop a legend. You just let the story rewrite itself. Sloane came to a halt before me. His eyes locked mine. He paused long enough for the entire tent to notice, long enough that when he saluted, it felt like a signal echoed deeper than brass. General. Ma'am. It wasn't a formal introduction. No rank pinned on my chest. Just raw acknowledgement. Internal network, hidden war stories, names unspoken on news. Time stretched. The world paused for a heartbeat. Claire gasped. A breath caught halfway. General, who, she said, voice thin but loud enough for heads to turn. Sloane didn't falter, didn't bow. He stayed steady. Echo 7, he said. Just loud enough that 2 rows away I heard the whisper. Ridgeport operator. Another voice legend shut it down. A third. She was discharged years ago. Sloane lifted his head. Discharged! His voice was incredulous. Then he lowered his gaze. Or redeployed. He took a small step. She didn't vanish. She was redirected. Henry Caldwell, a young officer with a tablet, stood up. Sir, he said, I was at Ridgeport. Heard about the shutdown. I just want to say, thank you, General. Caldwell's voice shook. But the salute he offered felt electric. No hesitation, pure respect. Others followed. A wave of recognition swept forward. Claire walked to the centre plaque in hand. She faced me. She didn't speak. Her chest was tight. Tears welled, pride, regret, confusion. She drew a steady breath. Richard stared, his head tilted down. He stood, but his posture wavered. Jules, he whispered. He didn't know what to ask, what world he was living in anymore. All she did, Sloane said, voice carrying again, was seal a leak that would have cost us lives. He turned to face the assembly. Some of you heard it called a withdrawal. That's a lie. This woman never left. She never surrendered. She served differently. I stepped forward then, just 1 foot. Enough to show I existed. Not to challenge, just to be seen. I didn't look at my father. I didn't look at Claire. I looked at Caldwell. No civilian died. No active intel lost. That's service. Sloane nodded once. And that's why she earned the title, whether public records say it or not. A silence deeper than any speech followed. Then the salutes began, gentle, spontaneous, sincere. A ripple of full military respect sweeping in from all corners. Some unfamiliar faces, some ones I'd quietly watched over the years. They didn't speak, they just stood. Richard sank back to his seat, mouth open and speechless. My mother's eyes shimmered. Claire stood barefoot in her honour, every happy memory twisting around her spine. Sloane lowered his head to the flag behind us. He stepped back, walking out of the tent single file, yet carried the weight of every name he represented. The ceremony fractured into something else after that. Some talked. Some wept. Some turned to find me, eyes wide, lips trembling. But I wasn't looking for them. I turned, slipped through the side exit toward the tech vehicle where my kit waited. I paused outside, hearing Claire's voice behind me. Jules? No, General, just sister to sister. I turned once. She stood framed in the lit doorway plaque tucked behind her back. I'm sorry, she whispered almost inaudibly. For everything. I didn't answer, just nodded. A slow acknowledgement. The night was fresh air. My heart hummed with quiet truth. The room had shifted. My name, unspoken in public records, had performed its first public act. I walked away, but I didn't get far. Not before General Sloane's voice, low but unmistakable, broke the silence behind me. "Colonel Hartley," he said. The words didn't stop me, but the weight of them did. I turned slowly. The air in the hall was thick with confusion, curiosity, and something more volatile recognition rising too late. Claire was still at the podium, her plaque trembling in her hands. Richard hadn't sat down again. My mother had moved 2 steps forward from her seat, clutching her purse like it might anchor her to the floor. General Sloane didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "For those of you wondering," he said, glancing around the hall, the officer who just left this room was responsible for saving Ridgeport's Eastern Division from exposure from collapse and from international fallout. She didn't do it for glory. She did it while the world thought she'd vanished, while her name was stripped, while her own family turned from her. He turned then, not toward the crowd, but toward my father. "Your daughter," he said, held the line when others broke it. "She stayed upright when systems failed. She is the standard your institutions failed to meet." Richard didn't speak. His jaw clenched tight, but his eyes, they looked lost, not angry, not proud, just bewildered, like someone waking from a dream and realizing it was never real. Claire stepped away from the podium. "Jules," she called softly. I didn't answer. "Wait, please." She was walking toward me now, still in full uniform. Her boots echoed across the linoleum. "Why didn't you say anything? Why let me believe? Why let them believe that you failed?" I held her gaze, because saying something would have made it about me. Claire stopped a few steps away. Her voice cracked. "I told people you quit. I thought you broke under pressure. I said things I know I said. You were supposed to. That was part of the plan." She blinked, trying to make sense of it. "But why?" I looked around the room, at the banners, the staged pride, the controlled applause, and let my eyes settle on Richard. "Because there are wars you win quietly, not with medals, not with speeches, with silence, with shadows, and sometimes with being forgotten." The crowd hadn't moved. Even now, people remained frozen, watching. Then, from behind, my mother's voice, thin and shaking, cut through. "You always stood so straight, even when they bent you." She stepped forward, her hand to her chest. "I told the neighbours you worked in a warehouse. I wanted to protect you from their questions." She paused, but I was ashamed. And I see now, I should have been proud. My throat tightened, not from the words themselves, but from how long I'd waited to hear something like them. Richard stepped forward, slow and uncertain. He looked different, older somehow, in just minutes. "Jules," he said, and then paused. "I taught honour like it was doctrine, but I didn't recognise it when you lived it." His hand twitched like he might salute. He didn't. Instead, he looked at General Sloane. "You knew who she was." Sloane didn't hesitate. "She trained under Orion protocols. She's carried out more classified interventions than most officers in your entire chain of command. Her name is buried under 10 layers of clearance because people tried to silence her and failed." Richard nodded once slowly. "I believed the system. I forgot to believe my own daughter." Claire looked between the 2 men, then back to me. "You always said doing the right thing means being willing to be the villain in someone else's story." I didn't understand it then, and now I asked. She gave a broken smile. "Now I think you might have saved us all." Silence again. But this time it wasn't awkward. It was reverent. I didn't cry. I didn't thank anyone. I just nodded and said, "Now you know." Then I turned toward the exit once more. This time, no one stopped me. The night pressed in quiet, cool, expectant. I walked out through the side door toward the emptying parking lot, the hum of conversation trailing like an echo. My steps were steady, even calm, but inside something untied itself, a tension wound tight for years now beginning to release. I kept strolling across the lights and shadows until I saw Claire leaning against the chain-link fence outside the base perimeter. She was still in her dress blues helmet hanging by her side. The hall's glow was distant now, but her face glowed in the moonlight, pale and resolute. She looked small at that moment, so much younger than the officer everyone at the ceremony had just praised. I stopped 15 feet away, hands in pockets watching. She didn't move for a moment. Then she raised her head. Jules. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Her voice carried a lifetime in that single word. Accusation, apology, hope. I didn't turn, I didn't speak. I simply stayed where I was letting her name land in the night air. She began swallowed and started again like calibrating. I'm transferring, she said. The sentence hung even in the dark. Internal oversight. The program, the work you did. She paused. I don't want medals. I want to do what you did, protect what matters, not just fight, and I want to learn from you. I thought of all the times I had protected systems, intel, lives unseen silent. I thought of how I left the world believing I'd failed so I could succeed at what mattered. This isn't a path, I finally said. It's a responsibility, a burden, not easy. She stepped forward, then closed 10 feet in silence. Send me. Her voice was hoarse with unspent years. Let me walk alongside. I know I can't follow your steps, I'd never want to. But I want to see the world the way you did. And I want to fix what I broke. I looked at her reflection in the dark glass of a parked car, the woman I was, and the woman I loved both right there beside me. I'll train you, I said quietly, but only after you learn to stand by the margins first. I meant inside the system and outside it. This isn't about you following me. It's about you finding your own way through the shadows. She nodded, head dipping into the moon. Understood. Claire looked small again, except now I saw her standing straighter, more determined. I thought about the past couple days, about how she'd passed the hidden files, how she'd spoken with our parents, how she'd faced the hall full of eyes that had misjudged me. And now she was here. We stood in silence a little longer. The wind moved the fence's shadow across her cheek. Sounds from the base, muffled talk footsteps, a distant engine drifted through. Finally, I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small metal badge, the one from Ridgeport from Orion. My hand trembled slightly as I flipped it so it caught the moonlight. You earned this tonight, I said, tapping it lightly. But it's not yours until you make it yours. She inhaled, lips pressed. I don't need it, she whispered. I want it. I paused, then offered it. Her fingers flicked out, brushed mine, and took the badge. It felt real, solid, not an echo or symbol, but an acknowledgement. Good, I said. Now come inside. Tomorrow we begin. Claire exhaled, smiling small. I'll be ready. We started walking back toward the gate. No hurry, no music. Just two sisters stepping together into something they were still figuring out. Before the gate, she stopped and turned to me. Truce, she asked. Truce, I agreed. She reached out and touched my arm, steady, brief. Then she stepped through the gate and disappeared into the base. I waited for a moment until the guard closed the gate. The night, which felt heavy before, seemed to breathe easier now. I turned and walked toward my vehicle. The badge felt alive in my pocket. There was work ahead, secret, solemn, necessary. I had no announcement to make, no fanfare, just purpose. And as I drove away, leaving the base behind, I thought, finally, someone carried on. And I wasn't alone in guarding the silent line. The road stretched ahead like a clean break. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the horizon wore that grey-blue look of something just waking up. I drove without music, the kind of quiet that lets the weight of the past breathe beside you. The farther I got from Fort Holden, the lighter the air felt, not because I was escaping anything, but because something had finally shifted. I'd given my silence years. Now it had spoken, and I could finally let go. 3 towns over, I pulled into a fuel station just as the lights came on inside the convenience store. The attendant didn't look up. I grabbed coffee black and a breakfast sandwich I wouldn't finish. At the register, a boy no older than 17 rang me up. His name tag read Mason. I paid cash, no questions, no ID, just a nod. Back in the car, I reached into my satchel and pulled out the folder. Inside was everything that mattered. The Ridgeport debrief, a log of my years in Orion, redacted transcripts of field analyses and ethics findings, each one stamped with the seal no civilian ever sees. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't confession. It was evidence quietly recorded, ready to be archived. I mailed it from a Dropbox 2 hours south, a town so quiet even the birds seemed cautious. No return address, no explanation. Just the final page handwritten in my old field notes notebook. I didn't give up. I just didn't follow their script. Below that, I added one last line. The right thing doesn't need applause. It just needs to be kept upright. The box clicked shut, and I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, just to make sure I didn't feel anything like regret. I didn't. I drove north again out of reach of Orion Fort Holden. Northpine, all of it. No final mission awaited me. No medal. But that was never the point. The silence had always been the point. It had kept the work intact. A week later, I sat by a lake in a cabin I'd rented anonymously, cell reception. Barely there, Wi-Fi non-existent. I watched the water stay still until wind whispered across its surface, reminding me that even calm isn't truly still. A loon called across the far end. A ripple followed. That's what truth does when it's left undisturbed. It eventually returns softly in waves. I opened a letter I'd written months earlier, but never sent. It had no address, just a name on the envelope, to whoever thinks she's invisible. Inside I'd written, "We are not here for praise. We are not here for legacy. We are here to hold the line when no one else will. And when we walk away, no one claps, but the world holds." I folded it back, placed it under a rock beside the dock, and walked away. That night, the stars looked less distant. I poured myself tea, sat on the porch, and opened the last message from Orion. A simple line from Evelyn Echo 7 has gone silent, considered stable, file sealed. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. Then I powered off the device and placed it inside a steel lockbox that I buried beneath the floorboards. When I lay down to sleep, it was the first time in years I didn't reach for my comms device before closing my eyes. The quiet didn't need interpreting anymore. It was enough to simply exist inside it. The world had shifted. My part in it had too. No brass bands, no salutes. Just the knowledge that somewhere in Northpine's new ethics division, my file would resurface, scrubbed of lies, retitled in truth. And maybe one day a cadet would read it. And maybe she'd know that silence isn't failure, that the invisible can still hold ground, and that sometimes disappearing is how we protect what matters. If you've ever been the silent one in the room, the one who wasn't called on, who wasn't seen, who was told you didn't belong, I want you to know this. There are more of us than you think. People who stood firm while others turned away. People who chose quiet integrity over loud approval. You are not weak. You are not invisible. You are holding something sacred, truth, decency, and sometimes even the cost of courage. And maybe you didn't get a medal for it. Maybe your story was erased or twisted or worse, never told. But it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't mean it didn't matter. I've learned something over the years. Healing doesn't always come with grand gestures. Sometimes it's a walk without your phone, a book that makes you cry for the right reasons, a voice in a podcast that says, "Hey, I see you." These small things, they count. They remind us that we're still here, that we're still whole even when the world tries to fracture us. So, wherever you are, folding laundry in silence, watching this on a train, scrolling at 2 a.m., thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. If this story touched something in you, maybe share it with someone who needs to hear it too. Or leave a comment and say hi. I'd love to know where this story landed. And if you want more stories like this, real ones, quiet ones, ones that carry weight without shouting, consider subscribing. It helps voices like mine, and maybe one day voices like yours find their way through the noise. We're not alone. We never were.